Let's begin Unit 15, Treatment of Substance Use Disorders, Part 1, with a discussion of what the drug counselor needs to know about AA and similar self-help groups. We'll begin with a brief tour of recovery land. Remember, the roots of substance abuse treatment are in the recovery movement, the self-help movement. Many people who work in professional mental health treatment have had very little exposure to that recovery mindset and recovery community. Recovery land has a very particular culture. One of the big factors is Alcoholics Anonymous, both the book and the fellowships and meetings. So while I can't give you a whole lot about AA in a short video, a little bit about AA history. It began as a self-help group in the late 1930s. And it began by collecting together a number of alcoholics who met, often in people's kitchens, drank coffee and talked among themselves, and developed a system for recovery and for supporting each other in recovery. So AA provides both a 12-step system, and that, if you study it, can be understood as a therapeutic model. The steps were derived from sound psychological principles at the time. And AA also provides ongoing support system of other recovered people that you can associate with. Part of the program that developed, while it's not in the original Alcoholics Anonymous textbook, includes the idea of sponsors and sponsorship. And this came about at one of the meetings in which they found so many newcomers were wanting to arrive that if all the new people who were still drinking came, it would turn into a group of alcoholics who were still practicing rather than a group that was recovering. And as a result, they created the first speakers meeting, and the idea that people who had some time in the program would help others, sponsor others to come to the everyday meeting rather than the once-a-week speakers meeting. There are 3 separate 12s that people who are involved with Alcoholics Anonymous are aware of. The 12 steps, originally the 12 steps were 3 steps, which were then expanded to 6 and finally to 12. Every alcoholic, of course, was looking for the loophole. Besides the 12 steps, which is a process of recovery, there are 12 traditions, or the rules that groups are governed by. And there are the 12 concepts of world service. It's important to understand, to those who have not been involved in a self-help group, and AA, while it's the granddaddy of the fellowships, the self-help movement, there are now over 200 12-step meetings, groups that have come about as a result of using the AA model and modifying the steps for other problems. But one of the things that I want students to understand is the difference between a meeting and a fellowship. A meeting is something that occurs once a week. It might, or several times a week, but it usually occurs at a church or a bank or a school, and it meets at that time, and that's it. A fellowship is a group of members of Alcoholics Anonymous, and by the way, you're a member if you say you are. The only requirement for membership is the desire to stop drinking. So the members get together, they rent a room, and there might be a meeting every morning, every noon, every evening, more on the weekend. There are a lot of meetings that occur in that one room, and there is never anything else, unlike a school or a church where there are other activities, and AA simply rents the room in the fellowship hall once a week. I encourage people new to recovery to check out some fellowships if they're available, because that means that once you go there, you know that any night of the week that you need to go to a meeting, there's likely to be a meeting available at that location. Originally, there were no AA meetings. The book, Alcoholics Anonymous, was purchased either in a bookstore or by mail order, and people read it, and as a result of following the simple principles in it, got sober. But as more and more people had read the book and got sober, meetings sprung up. Originally, more like a book club that read the book, discussed it, and tried to help each other. There are many different types of AA meetings in different parts of the country. They have different personalities. Even within a town, you may have some in the richer parts of town and some in the very poor parts. I've seen meetings in our town, one in which people arrive in their BMWs and their Lexus and they come to the noon meeting. And if you haven't been sober for 20 or 30 years, you probably won't be called on to speak. Another meeting in a very poor part of town, you see homeless people park their shopping cart in front of the meeting and come in and share. So each meeting has its personality. Open meetings are those that anyone who wants to come can come to, whether you're an alcoholic or not. Most fellowships are open because they encourage people who are unfamiliar with Alcoholics Anonymous to come, listen, and understand what's happening here. There are a few closed meetings which are for alcoholics only. Some seem to have a particular theme. Some closed meetings may be for doctors or lawyers or police officers. Some of these aren't even on the schedule but are referred specifically. There are women's only meetings, and in early recovery I encourage women to go to at least one women's only meeting, more if possible. One of the dangers in AA, in any 12-step program, is the way in which people develop a new love interest, sometimes called the 13th step. The idea that if they just met the right person, fell in love, had sex, then they would no longer want to drink. Well, attending a men's only, or in the case women's only, or in the case of men, a stag meeting, a men's only meeting, takes some of that hooking up and using love and sex as another drug out of the picture. There are speaker meetings where various people get up and talk, people with years of sobriety. There are young people's meetings designed for teenagers or even younger. There are smoking and non-smoking. More and more meetings are going non-smoking indoors because of health concerns. Frequently you'll see a lot of the smokers out in the parking lot. Some meetings even have smoke breaks partway through. There are open participation meetings where people can talk about anything they want. A large number of the meetings are what are called book studies. People might read a section from the big book, meaning the book titled Alcoholics Anonymous. You see it here with the original circus jacket cover. The idea there was to make it very attractive for people to buy in bookstores. After that first edition, they discovered that people bought it and took that paper cover off immediately. Subsequent editions all come with a dark blue cover and no paper jacket, or no obvious paper jacket. There's another book called 12 and 12, the 12 Steps and the 12 Traditions, and people might read a paragraph or two from that and then discuss it. And there's a smaller book called As Bill Sees It, which are collected writings of Bill W., one of the early founders of Alcoholics Anonymous. So book studies may be an important part of the meetings, but so are open participation and other types. There's a particular AA culture, and I'm focusing here on AA, but the same thing is true of Narcotics Anonymous, Gamblers Anonymous, and so on. We need to think of culture in a broader sense than simply race or ethnicity. People who are in the drug-using culture all know certain expressions. Alcoholics know probably 3 or 4 bartenders by their first name. They all know straight up, on the rocks, beer back, chaser, etc. People who use injectable drugs know the expression going to the cotton. So what makes up culture? Culture is the language you use, the way you dress, the food you eat, and so on. So each 12-step group has developed a sort of culture, and there's a culture of recovery. People who get into recovery usually give up their beer-themed or marijuana-themed t-shirts. They get rid of those little pot leaf emblems that were hanging from their rearview mirror. They began to change where they go. They don't stop by the bar or the crack house. And so gradually they shift from a culture of using and addiction to a culture of recovery. When people go to the AA meeting, there is typically a sequence. There are readings. The secretary or chairman will hand out some brief readings for people to do. There may be a sign-in sheet that's sent around. Remember, the sign-in sheet is not a type of attendance. They should be shredded or destroyed after the meeting. It's a way of helping whoever is chairing the meeting know who to call on to read various passages. If you don't want to be reading or talking, you simply don't sign in and pass the sheet on. When I send students to meetings, I tell them the proper response, if they're called on, is simply to say, either to introduce themselves as a student or to simply say, I just want to listen, and that's perfectly okay. There's no going back to find out who was at an AA meeting last Wednesday night, as the sign-in sheets are destroyed after the meeting in an effort to preserve anonymity. The seventh tradition came about a long time back, and there's a long story about that, but the idea being that AA does not, or AA meetings do not accept large gifts from anyone who is not a member. They don't accept large gifts from members. Members are limited in what they can give each year, and if you're not a member, they ask you not to contribute. The idea being that if there was a particular religious group that sponsored an AA meeting or a political group or something else, then they would begin to control the meeting, and that could end up destroying the focus on not drinking and recovery. So at each meeting they pass the basket, and the money should be enough that the meeting can pay its bills, rent the room, pay for coffee or whatever they do, and so on. If they don't collect enough money, well, the meeting stops existing, and some other meeting may open up somewhere else. Court cards are a common expression. Court cards are not a part of AA's traditions. They're something imposed from outside. Each secretary decides in each meeting how they're going to handle it. Court cards may be a specific document that a judge tells someone to go to meetings, AA or NA, and get signatures and prove they're attending as part of their staying out of jail. But for general purposes, there's no such thing as a court card. A court card is any piece of paper that someone brings, puts their name on, turns into the secretary at the beginning of the meeting, sits through it, then at some point, probably the end, the secretary will sign the cards or the papers and give it back to people. I ask my students when they go to attend a meeting to have that experience, just like what they would assign one of their clients. Go, turn in a piece of paper. It's kind of embarrassing the first time you do it. Get it signed, bring it back to me to prove that they sat through the meeting. There's also a lot of people who resist Alcoholics Anonymous, saying they don't believe in a particular deity, or they aren't religious, or they're atheists. It's important to remember that early on, AA decided that they weren't going to mix religion with recovery. And while many members believe in God as a specific higher power, there are AA meetings in countries which are of various religions. Buddhists would refer to this as the good. And so there's no real requirement that you have a religious belief, only that you believe there is some standard of right and wrong beyond your own decision making. If you're an alcoholic, your decision making wasn't too good. And in early recovery, many people will use the steps or the meeting or some other thing. So your preconceived notions about religion shouldn't keep someone from attending Alcoholics Anonymous and seeing if the 12-step method and the support system there will help them in their recovery. For more information, please visit the counselorsoapbox.com blog, where you will find articles on mental health, substance abuse, and having a happy life. The David Joel Miller fiction and nonfiction books are available on Amazon.